Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation, Insurance for COVID-19 Losses. Before we begin, we have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements, and then I'll introduce today's presenter. So our housekeeping announcements, you may have noticed that you're currently in listen-only mode. This is to cut down on the amount of background noise and to ensure that everyone can hear our wonderful presenter. However, you are welcome and encouraged to ask questions during today's presentation. On your screen, you should still have the GoToWebinar pop-up, and one of the buttons for that pop-up is a questions button. If you enter your questions through that button, I will be able to help and ensure that these get answered by our presenter. And if you have any technical questions, I'll be available to answer those during the presentation as well. Second announcement. Today's presentation is not pre-certified for CLE credit. It is an informational webinar at this time. However, we will be providing informational materials after the webinar, as well as a link to today's recording. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Mr. Robert Frankel. He is a fantastic practitioner of insurance recovery law, has practiced in the field for 17 years, and is a fantastic author as well. He's the author of 2 separate texts on Fastcase, as well as numerous journal articles, and has done many presentations on the topic of insurance recovery and insurance-related issues. Today's topic, insurance for COVID-19 losses, is a wonderful update on the subject that is so very important for so many of us practicing in these days. So I know that you'll enjoy today's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over in just a second to Mr. Frankel. I just want to remind everyone again that you're welcome to ask questions during today's presentation. Please use the questions button on your GoToWebinar pop-up to ask those questions, and those will be answered as appropriate during today's presentation. All right, turning it on over.
Thank you, Erin. My name is Rob Frankel, and the topic today is insurance for COVID-19 losses. I would like to reiterate that if you have a question, it's a good idea to send it to Erin when you have it. And she's not going to, I think at an appropriate time, she'll jump in with a question if it makes sense, and not necessarily wait till the end. So I do like and encourage questions. So on the agenda today is we're going to go through the type of losses that are caused by COVID-19. We'll go through some general principles of insurance, and then we're going to get into the meat of the policies, event cancellation policy, including the coverage grant, exclusions and conditions, business interruption insurance, with the issues of covered property, direct physical loss or damage, covered cause of loss, valuation and conditions. We might touch on some of the third-party insurance policies like workers' comp, comprehensive general liability, directors' officers, errors and omissions, employment practices liability, and then we'll end with some additional resources for you. COVID-19 losses, we like to categorize them I like to categorize them for purposes of insurance between first party and third party. First party means they're suffered by the policyholder himself or herself or itself. So if you have been infected or you have the fear of infection by the virus, you as a policyholder could get coverage, and some of the coverages you could get if you have to go to the hospital, medical insurance, if you become disabled as a result of it and can't work, disability insurance, and life insurance if unfortunately you pass away. Obviously, it would be your estate that would bring the claim for life insurance. This is not going to be part of the presentation today. The main things are going to be the loss of business income, which will be under event cancellations, the businesses that hold in-person events and meetings, and business interruption insurance for other businesses. And then there are some third-party losses. You might have third parties that suffer injuries, such as your employees, and you would have claims possibly under workers' comp injuries. And there might be non-employees or employees outside the scope that suffer bodily injury caused by exposure to COVID-19. There may be some personal advertising injuries, and some of the torts there may be invasion of privacy, false arrest, defamation claims, and then you may lose your job, or someone might lose a job or have other economic harms and might sue you. And so there's other policies that respond to those type of losses. So the first general thing to understand about insurance is that there's two types of policies, first and third party insurance, and they line up with first and third party injuries. So first party insurance provides insurance to the policy himself, herself, or itself for losses suffered by the policyholder. So that is distinguishable from third party insurance, because in third party insurance, it provides coverage for losses suffered by a third party and makes a claim against the policyholder. So examples of first party insurance are life, health, disability, homeowners, renters, commercial property, and builder's risk, where the loss is actually suffered by the third party. It's also known as litigation insurance because a third party is going to sue the policyholder for the loss he, she, or it suffers. And then some of the examples are workers' comp, comprehensive general liability, directors and officers, errors and omissions. EIL stands for environmental impairment liability, and EPLI stands for employment practice of the liability insurance. And then there's some policies just from a general perspective, so you know, that are hybrid in the sense that they provide those first party and third party benefits. Auto policy, as you know, is a liability, a third party policy that provides coverage for claims made against you in operation of your vehicle, but it also has employed and underemployed insurance. The homeowner's policy, your home generally provides you for coverage for damage to your home as a result of a covered cause of loss. It provides some third party benefits too, like it might provide some liability insurance for actions you do in your personal pursuits as opposed to business pursuits. For COVID-19 losses, line the losses up with the policies. So the first party policies, again, are life, health, and disability, event cancellation, and business interruption insurance. And then third party policies are generally not, there's nothing really unique about COVID-19. Directors and officers, errors and omissions, and EPLI. Another, besides first and third party insurance, some of the other general principles to understand about insurance before we get into it is that this presentation is structured around the standard form language. And the standard form language is early in use. It's produced by ISO, but you need to understand that the language can change over time. And I'm getting another noise on the screen. Okay, so not only can the language change over time, but often non-standard forms are in use. So what I have in yellow is that the plain language ultimately controls the interpretation. So while I can give you a general discussion about how the policies apply, you always need to go back to your insurance policy and look at the actual language in use, because they do change over time. The other thing that you want to look at when you're looking at is when you're looking at policy, you want to consult the dictionary and the policy definition so that you can understand what that plain language means. That's always the starting point. And if things are still not clear, you would use some rules of construction. For example, there's a rule of construction that the specific controls the general. That's not just for insurance; it's for many contracts. It's for wills and trusts and estates. And there's another one: the exclusion of one thing means inclusion of all others. There's many other rules of construction. There's a rule of construction against ambiguities and resolving, in some places, resolving an ambiguity against. And the other thing you need to remember is that state law controls, which means that in many of these situations, there's a majority approach, a minority approach, and sometimes there might be an intermediate approach to these, a third or fourth interpretation to some of these specific interpretation questions. Another general concept is that the freedom of contract allows insurance companies to contract around judicial interpretations. What does that mean? So throughout history, there's been 3 different forms of pollution exclusions in use. It was the qualified, the absolute, and the total pollution exclusion. Each one of them derives from results that the insurance industry may not have liked in interpreting the last one. So that's an example of where they drafted their way around bad decisions. The mold exclusion is another one. And now cyber liability exclusions may be a third one. So the first major coverage we're going to get into is event cancellation insurance. And that applies to entities that hold concerts, annual meetings, live education events, much like the company that I work for now. The event cancellation policy is generally sold by unique insurers. Lloyd's is a very large issue, so it's not sold. Not a lot of them are sold by the domestic insurers. These policies generally cover. I think that some of the domestics do cover them though too. Generally covered for unavoidable losses due to cancellation, curtailments, postponements, changes in venue, abandonments, and enforced reduced attendance. So the general question that comes from that that triggering clause is, what's an unavoidable loss? So these policies are not have not been extensively litigated, but having just submitted a claim and seeing the questions that they ask, it's pretty clear from all the information that they're asking that unavoidable loss would mean where you're canceling an event, but you're forced to cancel it. It's not your choice to cancel it. So it seems from their questions and the questionnaire that they're really triggering in on governmental orders requiring the event not to take place. But I think that if you had an outbreak of a disease and it was covered, and you didn't have a governmental order, and you had a reduced attendance, you might have a claim. It's just these policies have not been litigated extensively, and I suspect in the next 3 or 4 years we're going to see the litigation come out on these policies now. Now the second issue is, what's the cause of the unavoidable loss? So that would, since it's a first party policy, there's either an all risk policy or a name risk policy. And what's the significance of that? So generally, if it's all risk, it means it covers the loss, the unavoidable loss caused by any risk, except if the risk is specifically excluded. The name risk policy says it would cover the loss if it's caused by the name risk has to be specifically excluded. So you would need the pandemic to be included. So the next issue that you would get into is the exclusions, and many of these policies have a communicable disease exclusion, as we did. This insurance does not cover any loss arising directly or indirectly out of, contributed to, by, or resulting from any communicable disease, or fear or threat thereof, whether actual or perceived. Our policy defines communicable disease as a pandemic declared by the World Health Organization or a federal or local government agency. So clearly COVID-19 would have been excluded with this exclusion. So if you've got an exclusion for a pandemic, and you don't have what I'm going to get to now, which is a communicable disease extension, you would have to rely upon concurrent or efficient proximate causation, which is basically where there's multiple causes of loss. One has to be a covered cause of loss. So you would need another covered cause of loss. For example, you got a government order in place. That may be an alternative cause in some of these policies. And so you would need to establish that the government order is really concurrent or efficient proximate cause of the loss. And you need to be in a jurisdiction where they accept that. But you would also need to have a policy, which you would probably litigate if you had this policy, but that language is the draft around. When I said before, you know, insurance industry drafts policies and new language to deal with bad results. This is an example of it. They may not be arising directly. The language in yellow is an example of anti-efficient and anti-concurrent causation proximate cause language, where they attempt to avoid those doctrines, and there is some mixed result. There's mixed decisions on whether that draft around actually works. So it really depends upon the jurisdiction you're in, whether that's going to apply. But lucky for us, we bought a communicable disease enforcement, which the language is there. And it basically extends coverage for irrecoverable expenses and loss of net profit arising out of the outbreak of a communicable disease, notwithstanding the foregoing, but then it takes away any threat or fear. So this is a cell coverage vaccine that we always see. We follow it with pollution. They sell back the environmental impairment liability after they exclude it. They sell back mold after they exclude it. They sell back cyber liabilities after they exclude it. So one of the first issues that you'll come across with this endorsement is whether you have an outbreak or it's the threat or fear, because under the language, the outbreak itself triggers the coverage, but the fear or fear of threat or fear of the communicable disease does not. And I remember in my discussion with the adjuster, he was mentioning, well, you're canceling it because people are afraid to get the communicable disease. And I jumped right back and said, you know, that is a totally ridiculous interpretation, because you're telling me that every single person has to actually contract the disease for this coverage to apply. You're basically collected a premium and didn't give me any coverage if that's the case. And I think that argument won because we ultimately got coverage. You might face that if you have this, because of the language seems to lead to that. And so what is your losses if you get triggered? Your losses are going to be your expected net profit and your unavoidable expenses. So what's the expected net profit? That would be what you showed on your final budget when you're putting together your events. And so, you know, even if you're not meeting the sales that you thought you were going to meet because of this, you're still entitled to what you would have gotten if you didn't have this outbreak. Because, you know, the outbreak comes in March, you have a meeting scheduled for May, and at least for us, you know, our signups were not as high as maybe we would have expected in a normal time, but it didn't matter because we had budgeted a certain number in it. But for the outbreak, we would have hit that number. We've been hitting that number for the last 10 years. And then you would subtract out from the expected profit things you can earn from rescheduling all or portion of the event, if possible. So we had in addition to having an annual meeting, we also had an education course, an in-person education course for one of our certifications that we could reschedule. And so we subtracted out the profit we would have made from that in-person event because we were able to reschedule it in a different forum. Then you would need to, you're entitled to unavoidable expenses, which means you need to mitigate your damages by avoiding expenses, which is exercising force majeure. And one of the things that I found very useful was in enforcing coverage ahead of time before the event was pointing out to the adjuster that we are at the best time right now to exercise force majeure. Had an order in place where people couldn't meet and everything was shut down. And so at that point, we were able to exercise force majeure and get out of most of our obligations. You would need to, as soon as you have notice of a possible event, you would need to provide notice to the insurance company. And then you need to provide proofs of losses. And they give you all of these forms to fill out explaining why your loss is. And to me, I thought it was kind of like a trap for the unwary to some extent, because they want you to say, well, we can't hold the event, and put fear in there. And you want to make sure, if you have this, that we're canceling it because of the outbreak. We're canceling it because we want the safety of the people, and we have this outbreak of the disease. So you have to keep reiterating that to them, as opposed to, well, we can't sell the event because of the outbreak. I think it's always better to try to make your proof of loss match what your cause is. And that really was the cause. It's the outbreak of the disease that's causing everything. And then you would need to show your proof of cancellation and your refunds for that. So, Aaron, this is a good point if anyone has any questions on event cancellation.
Yes, we have a question. And also, I do want to encourage you to use your headset instead of the speaker mode, because there's a little bit of background noise on your end. The question from the audience is, regarding cancellations, do you recommend that large events such as events hosted at hotels or at stadiums or things of that nature, do you recommend that they seek a letter from their government indicating that their event has been restricted or is otherwise not going to be able to go forward in the manner needed? Essentially, do you recommend when they're trying to file for their insurance, they include a letter of that nature?
I don't think you need the letter. You usually have a government order, but the letter's not going to hurt if you get it. But you're going to need, if you don't have a government order in place and you actually can hold the event, but you get a letter, I don't think that's going to help you, especially if the order allows for the event to take place.
Excellent. And again, just encouraging you to make sure you're on your headset mode and not on speakerphone to cut down the background noise. And I think we're ready to continue.
Okay, so the next major area is going to be the business interruption coverage. So you think about all of the owners and operators of premises that have been impacted by the 2-month shutdown. You have the hotels and landlords that are losing revenue, cancel events that we just discussed. You also have businesses that have been 2+ days from the stay-at-home orders. And the natural question is, can you seek coverage under your property damage, your business interruption portion of your policy? And I do think that's an interesting issue, because, whether or not it's covered today or not, I think a lot of it's going to depend upon the language of your policy. But the government did a PPP program, and they had all these programs where they're trying to get money to people. And really, this would have been the best place to use the insurance industry to sell coverage. If it's not covered, to sell back coverage for business interruption. So I would suspect that, to the extent that the courts agree with the insurance industry that these events, many of these events are not covered, I do think at the end of the day, there'll be some where there'll be coverage. But I think at the end of the day, this may be an area where they sell a new policy for a pandemic coverage. But in any event, business interruption coverage provides a separate coverage under the first-party property policy. It provides for loss of profits and continuing fixed costs during the period of restoration when the business experiences an interruption caused by a loss under the first-party policy. There's also, many of these have civil authority extensions, which got the government forcing closure. So these policies would seem to apply to these type of losses. Under both the business interruption and the civil authority extension, you still need to trigger the property damage clause. How do you trigger that? So an ISO form provides, we will pay for direct physical loss of or damage to covered property at the premises described in the declaration caused by or resulting from a covered cause of loss. So you get loss of business income if it's caused by a property damage trigger. And so you need to go through the three issues. Is there covered property? Has it been caused by a covered cause of loss? And do you have direct physical loss or damage to that covered property? So the first issue is you have covered property. The property definition section generally normally includes what the property is. It has an exclude section as a schedule of locations. It includes generally building equipment, tangible, personally, stock, personal property of others in the policyholder's control. It includes land and landscaping, but generally damage to land and landscaping is not covered. So, and then intangible property is excluded. So when we say stock, it's like farming stock or stock of goods. It's not intangible shares of stock in companies. So it's generally the building and equipment that is attached to the location that is covered property. So if a hotel has an event and the event's been canceled by COVID-19, the hotels who have lost money on this, they have covered property. Their hotel's listed. The question is whether the entities holding the events that are canceled, if they don't have event cancellation, can they trigger this? And it really depends on whether the rented space they use is listed or whether it's included under the definition section as covered property. And then for all the other businesses that were shut down by the stay-at-home order, I don't think this is going to be an issue because they would generally list their locations for which they use the space. So then, if you have a loss of covered property, which most of the time you will in this situation, has the covered property suffered direct physical loss of or damage to that covered property? So first, you would consult the definition for whether you have direct physical loss or damage. Because some of these policies may have a definition for that. Many don't. So then you consult the dictionary, and the general dictionary definitions right here. Loss is actual loss of possession, and damage is injury or alteration. So in most cases, it's really simple to tell whether you have direct physical loss or damage. You have a stained carpet, you have drywall damage, you have your property stolen. They're the easy cases. You'll never see them litigated. So then the question is whether you have contamination, like COVID-19 contamination, is that property damage? Maybe. The question is, how are you going to actually prove it? Do we have the ability to microscopically see that someone who had COVID-19 was on the property and actually placed germs on there? Or is it just fear? So I think the contamination one is difficult to prove that you have actual physical damage. So the question is, can you use loss of use or function from the general threat? The general threat of people contracting COVID-19, will loss of use or function work? And it's a split of authority issue. I'd say the majority is more no, but it really depends upon the jurisdiction. The language that we're looking at is direct physical loss or damage, and the case law seems to suggest that a physical, because it's easy to say physical modifies loss that precedes the word, but the question is, does physical modify damage? If physical is not construed as modifying damage, then you could potentially get contact resulting in imperceptible damage but loss of use or function may be enough to trigger that clause. And but if physical is deemed to modify damage, the perceptible alteration of property is generally required. As I said before, it's an easy issue. There's a split in authority, and here are the type of cases where we've seen loss of use or function constituting direct physical loss or damage to covered property. We've had cases where asbestos was contaminated, came out of when they were doing construction, asbestos contaminated the building. You might have misapplication. There's some misapplication of pesticide cases, some environmental contamination, some oil and gasoline spills. There was a meth lab in the basement of one unit. Some lead paint, carbon monoxide release, and then there were some harmless contamination cases like undercooked canned food, chemical affecting taste and smell of the food only, treatment with unapproved pesticide, and then the computer shutdowns. There's some cases on that. So many cases reject the loss of use or function argument, but that really, if that is going to be the most heavily litigated area, and it might be the area where some of you are going to be litigate to try to get your clients into coverage, or you're going to litigate to get yourself coverage. So if you are lucky enough to have covered property damage, direct physical loss to covered property, it would have to be caused by a covered cause of loss. And so it's generally defined in the policy, and the type of policy determines resolution where there's a single cause of loss. So if you have an all risk, the covered cause of loss is any loss except if it's specifically excluded. And a named peril says you're only covered for losses caused by specifically named perils. You know, our property policy doesn't have communicable disease exclusion. And so the all risk will likely be triggered, but the named peril might not be covered. So you would want to consult your policy to see if you have a named peril, whether a pandemic or a communicable disease is a loss that is covered. But if you have multiple causes of loss, and this is your way out. Concurrent and efficient proximate causation doctrines can alter the result for the one that we said is the problem, is the named peril policy. So one doctrine, concurrent causation, says you need a concurring cause to be a covered cause of loss. And then the efficient proximate cause doctrine says the predominating cause must be covered. So you want to consult the jurisdiction you're in to see whether they apply either or both of these doctrines. And if they do, that would be your way into covered cause of loss. But you need one of the causes that you're asserting to be a covered cause of loss. So we said before, there's governmental orders, right? So if you don't have an exclusion for law and ordinance exclusion in your policy, that's it. You would jump in and say the covered cause of loss is the government saying shut down. But many of them do have the law and ordinance exclusion. So you might have to be a little more creative with the other cause of loss. It could be some form of negligence by somebody else. That was an additional cause.
Before we go on, we do have a question related to the last two slides.
Okay.
So for all of these losses, what date of loss do you recommend? The date of the first stay in place order or some other date?
Well, it really depends upon the policy. I mean, if you get into it, I didn't get into this presentation because I didn't expect that, but generally the date of the loss is going to be defined by the jurisdiction you're in, and they follow different theories on trigger. So some may be the date of first exposure, and others may be the date, another date, like the date when you're first damaged where it's closed down. So I think you need to consult the policy, and you probably don't want to get locked down to a specific date if you're making a claim without knowing what the law is.
Excellent. And we do have a second question as well. Do you think that business interruption insurance could or should cover third-party losses such as those incurred by travel companies who are providing a service instead of an event?
The people that are providing services to the events, is that what the question is?
Yes, that's correct.
So for those entities, it really depends. I mean, should is I'm not going to get into. I mean, yeah, I personally think the way the insurance industry is so adept at handling losses, I think they would have been more efficient in rolling out funds from the government through this. And I also think that they're probably going to sell that type of coverage going forward to policyholders. Could it cover? It certainly could cover. It depends upon your policy language, and it really depends upon the specific facts of the circumstances. It's the same thing with the last question too. It really depends upon the facts, and it's really hard to give you an answer blindly without knowing the facts of the law. Okay, so any more questions? So I think we were on the contracting. So just as I had mentioned before, the common theme is the insurance companies try to contract out of the efficient proximate cause doctrine and eliminate coverage if any cause is excluded. And there, even if you have one, like we had before, I showed you the then cancellation exclusion. Even if you had an exclusion like that, or policy was excluded before, if you had an exclusion for that, and so you couldn't make the claim, you may be in a jurisdiction which doesn't even accept the contracting around. And so it's not a closed issue just because the policy says it looks closed. I remember one case I litigated, there was an exclusion that looked like it applied. And then if you actually looked at it, you saw that the insurance company stuck that exclusion in year 5 of the 20-year program and didn't properly notify the insurance company. Well, the loss occurred in year 10, and so nobody at the policyholder ever said, wow, we have a covered claim here, and they split the exclusion in without telling us. So naturally you look and you walk away. And they said, no, but you know what? If you go and look at the law, most of the places say you can't do that. They need to properly notify the insurance company. So it's not necessarily a dead case just because the language looks like it's a dead case. You should probably go talk to an insurance expert to make sure that you don't have coverage if your loss is large enough. But in any event, so as I said, this is an example of one where you might think, wow, they contracted around it, but you don't know if the jurisdiction actually accepts that contract around. I think generally, I haven't found a pandemic generally excludes, so this probably becomes a non-issue, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there are policies out there with a communicable disease exclusion. You know, the mold exclusion is another good example where they didn't like the case law. I mean, you think about it, mold is caused by moisture, right? So if they had a mold exclusion in place, and many jurisdictions did not enforce the draft around, and they found the actual cause was the cause of the moisture infiltration that led to mold. And so many of the mold exclusions were not enforced. And so what they did is they drafted around it and put a limitation on the amount you can recover with mold. So some of the things you should be aware of if you're dealing with a BI policy, business interruption, loss mitigation and sue and labor. So you need to, again, minimize your loss, and you're reimbursed for expenditures in those efforts. So you need, you know, again, I think a lot of that is force majeure and other ways to get out of contract liabilities. You need to do an appraisal for property damage, provide notice and a proof of loss. And many times, if you have a large enough claim, it's really helpful to get a public adjuster because they really know how to find every single nook and cranny that's covered for you. And then if you just have the contamination, even if you could find it at a microscopic level, you know, that's not going to be your main trigger for BI, because think about, you're just bringing in a heavy-duty cleaner to clean the property. Your period of restoration is going to be very minimal. So this is the valuation slide, lost profits and continuing fixed expense when the business experiences interruption. Extra expense is if you're at your location, you can't operate, but you can operate temporarily someplace else. You're paid the extra expense set up elsewhere. For example, if you can do it efficiently, and I can imagine that occurring, like if you're in a state where there's a total lockdown, but the neighboring state that might be only 10 miles away isn't in lockdown, and you can still get your customers to come. You could probably have to set up a temporary space 10 miles away. And then here's the calculation. I think some of the things you got to be aware of about is if you have an unprofitable business, that's an issue they'll litigate with you. There's some speculation. You need to, there's some speculation as to what the lost profits would be. And then what's the period of restoration? As I said before, quick cleaning is all you need. So it's really probably going to be the period of government shutdown. And then I'm sure that if this is litigated and you can trigger coverage, you will start hearing the wider economic offense that the pandemic didn't necessarily cause all of the recession, and that we're in a recession that's beyond that. And so you'll probably get that litigated too. So the last period, some of the third-party insurance. This is the litigation insurance. As I said, the third party has to suffer the injury. The bodily injury or property damage. If you have bodily injury or property damage, what's going to apply? Your workers' comp policy. Workers' comp. There's nothing really peculiar about a COVID-19 workers' comp claim. Do you have an employer who's been infected with the virus? Was he infected in the course and scope of his job, and did it cause him to have to seek treatment and lose work time? They're going to be your issues. So the same issues you would face with any type of injury or even virus that someone would contract on the job. It can be really hard to prove they did or didn't, where they contracted it. And then it depends on who the burden falls on. CGL, that would be someone contracts who's not an employee or an employee who's outside the course and scope. If they contract the disease, there's nothing really particular about, whether they have it or not. Your issues with CGL are going to be, we can get it to the next slide. The issues are going to be with CGL, whether you're legally obligated to pay. So someone's going to sue you. So it's going to be around the duty to defend and what's alleged in there. Whether you have bodily injury is easy. The property damage might be litigated if you just have contamination and someone's suing you for that. And then whether you're caused by an occurrence, but someone's going to sue you for some probably negligent act or something. So that's generally going to be covered. And then it's going to be whether it's within the scope, whether you get a defense. As long as it's alleged within coverage, you'll get a defense. So it looks to me like we're already at 45 minutes. And obviously we're going to share the slides with you. I think it's a good time to take questions. Here's some additional resources. As I said before, assistance from public adjusters, help for brokers, and trained insurance recovery lawyers. Here's my contact information if you have any questions that you think of afterwards. And then there's some other stuff on the slides if it's important to you. But in any event, I think it would be a good time to open up to some questions, Erin.
Sounds good. So one of the questions from the audience describes a situation where a policy does have a specific exclusion for bacteria and for viral situations. The question was, if the only damage that they're seeking is related to the government lockdown, the specific orders to shelter in place, would that be a situation where you would say that there could still be coverage even? I apologize if you one second.
Erin, I'm getting all this music on there.
Yes. Just 1 second. Let's
You hear?
let's make sure that that's muted out.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes, I think that's.
I'm hearing music. But
I do apologize, everyone. Give me just 1 second to let that come in. Rob, can you make sure that your slide is not showing that as well?
yeah, so I hear a bunch of music. I didn't hear any of the question, but I heard the beginning of it, which was, can you get coverage? I think it's the same thing I went through in the earlier slide. If you have multiple causations, you'd want to press a covered cause of loss as being the cause. The government order you would want to press. And assuming you don't have a law and ordinance exclusion, or you want to litigate that, that's your way into coverage. So you'd have to push that as being your cause.
Perfect. Okay, the second question we had from the audience, and I do apologize, I don't know what unmuted there. The second question that we had from the audience was regarding if somebody has a specific exclusion for communicable diseases, even if there's multiple causes, would you say that some of the damages that were inflicted from the situation would still be excluded?
No, I think I don't think you just walk away and say no. So if you got enough at issue, you're going to want to look at the issue. So it's really a question about what the real cause was. So cause could be the outbreak, but it could be also the government order related to the fear of everybody else contracting the disease. So I don't think you would just walk away depending upon the size of your loss. I think you'd want to try to narrow in. That's why for many of these practicing lawyers, your clients are looking for creative solutions around the language, and there's probably a ton of case law you could get to that could get your way into coverage, and you're at least going to get to court. And I'm sure that we will see a bunch of these business interruption claims coming in the next 2, 3, 4 years, because people suffered extensive losses, and they may not take no. And I'm not convinced how those cases are going to resolve. Even if loss of use or function has been an issue before, that could become more of a majority approach, that loss of use or function applies. So I hope that answers it.
It does. Regarding future issues, there is a lot of talk of viral issues returning in the fall and in the winter, a resurgence of the current situation. Is there something that you recommend when somebody is shopping for a new policy or a policy to cover a new exclusion in their old policy? What do you recommend for customers, or that people recommend for their customers in that shopping process?
I think I would recommend making sure you have a good broker and understands your needs and understands what a resurgence means to your business, and tries to figure out a way how, if there's a resurgence, you can get coverage. And so that's the best way to always start.
Excellent. Another question from the audience. Do you have any recommendations for how best to preserve a claim, which may be ongoing in our current situation, and the ongoing expenses incurred in decontamination or attempts to reopen with the current stages of the reopening orders?
You need to notify the insurance company when you have a loss, and not accept no for an answer, and not do acts that would be contradictory to the theories you're going to claim. So you probably would want to go to a trained expert, public adjuster, to help ensure that you preserve your claims.
Excellent. Okay. Another question from the audience. Regarding the issues related to universities which had to close, residential halls, etc., are actions to mitigate this, such as offering online classes, etc., actions that are contrary to the preservation of evidence for the loss?
No, but I would think that, as I said before, that the amounts you're able to mitigate and cut the loss is going to cut the size of your claim, because you're not supposed to collect more than you've lost. So.
Fair. Another audience question, what about broker liability for failure to address the issue of communicable disease with the insured?
You know, I think obviously broker liability may be litigated as well. It's hard to know. It's hard to just answer that generally without knowing the specific facts. But you know, I'm sure that'll be litigated. The fact that we haven't, they'll claim there hasn't been a pandemic since 1918, but I think there was SARS. There's some that occur. You could potentially argue they occur every 10 years, and maybe the industry should have seen this. I don't know. That'll be for a jury to decide if you choose to go forward with that.
Okay. Speaking to a future issue again from the audience, do you see any major changes in either legislation regarding epidemics and coverage, or actual insurance policy changes regarding this in the future beyond offering the separate third party or separate pandemic insurance? Do you see any overall changes coming in the future regarding general coverage?
I'm sure there's always changes, and I'm sure you'll see changes in language if the results don't come out the way the insurance industry expects. And you'll see, I wouldn't be surprised. I think the biggest change is they're going to start selling business interruption for a pandemic, and they would probably just have it as a separate endorsement that would not necessarily requiring the trigger of property damage.
Perfect. Okay, so those are all the questions that we had currently in the questions box. I just want to invite the audience, if you have any further questions, to please feel free to reach out to both Fastcase and to Mr. Frankel. You'll see his contact information is on the slide that's currently displayed. We will be providing a link to the recording from today's episode, as well as some of the materials from today's episode via follow-up email. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's presentation, and I encourage you to keep an eye on your email for announcements for further sessions. We have some fascinating speakers coming up in the near future.
Hey, Aaron, just one thing from me. So you're not frantically writing down this contact information. The slides will be provided to all of you that attended.
Yes, that's correct. So again, I do encourage everyone to reach out to us with any future questions or further questions you might have. And again, thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. Thank you very much for being our presenter today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.